and good afternoon, members of the Foreign Service Retirees Association of Florida. It's my very great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for our January annual general meeting, Andrew Natsios. Andrew is executive professor at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University and director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs. Over 5 decades of public and humanitarian service, Andrew Natsios has had 4 distinguished careers. The first was in state politics and government administration in Massachusetts, where he served in the Massachusetts state legislature, state government, and in the late 90s was CEO of the famous Big Dig highway and tunnel project in Boston. The second is his international career. First as director of the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance under Bush 41, vice president of World Vision in the 90s, administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, where I came to know him well, and later as special envoy to Sudan. The third is his military career, where he retired as a lieutenant colonel after 25 years and after having had an active duty deployment during the first Gulf War. And finally, his fourth act in academia, where he joined the Walsh School in Georgetown in 2006 and later moved to Texas A&M University, where, as I mentioned, he is currently executive professor. Professor Natsios is the author of and has contributed to at least 18 books on foreign affairs and international development, the latest being Transforming Our World, President George H.W. Bush and American Foreign Policy, co-edited with Andrew Card. He's also written numerous articles and op-eds on foreign affairs in journals and major newspapers. His latest book, Transforming Our World, is a collection of essays from people like James Baker, Richard Haas, Bob Kimmett, Dennis Ross, Nancy Berg, Condoleezza Rice, Jim Cunder, Tom Pickering, just to name a few, who offer reflections and stories on how Bush 41 and his national security team navigated the tectonic changes in global politics from 1989 to 1993. It's a fascinating read and available on Amazon, where the proceeds benefit the Scowcroft Center. And we've invited Professor Natsios to talk about the major themes from this book. Andrew, on behalf of the FSRA, welcome. It's great to see you again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frank. It's nice to be with you, even though it's from a distance. The motivation for this book came shortly after the death of the president a couple of years ago. And I decided, since a lot of my international career was a function of him personally and the positions that he appointed me to, and then his son appointed me to, which wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been in the first administration, because I had met George W. Bush only once when he came to speak for his father when he was running in 1988. But I had been the co-chairman with Andy Card. Andy was the chairman, I was the co-chairman with Paul Celluccio, later became governor of Massachusetts and then ambassador to Canada, and Leon Lombardi, who was the Chief Justice of the Land Court in Massachusetts. We were all young legislators in our 20s in those days, 1980, when he ran in the Republican primary against Ronald Reagan. And it's a funny story. It's not in the book, but all of the legislators were being waltzed by the candidates for president in 1980. Howard Baker was running, John Anderson, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, and I can't even, there were several others as well. And I got a call from George Bush, but I thought it was a college roommate of mine playing a joke on me. And so I was going to hang up on him. And I said, maybe it's not a good idea to do that. And so I asked him, it was a time that the Shah of Iran was on the way out. My uncle had been a career person in the other agency on the other side of the Potomac River, and in fact helped found the CIA when he was recruited to be an officer in the Greek Civil War in the early 1950s. Actually, two of my uncles were. And he was station chief in Vietnam in the 50s and a whole bunch of countries, South Korea. And my uncle had been he knew the Shah while he was in Tehran. And he said, these guys are crazy. We're taking his place. We should not allow this to happen or we're going to regret it. And exactly what Bush told me. And I said, I don't think this is a college friend of mine. And we began discussing foreign policy, and I realized it was actually George Bush. And so I told the president this story many years later, and I said, I'm glad I did not hang up on you, or I might not be here right now. He said, well, I would have laughed if you had done it, so don't worry about it. Anyway, so the motivation of the book was twofold. One is to honor him, but I didn't want it to be just a group, a set of eulogies. It's not eulogies. I mean, there are critical things in there, not many, but there are some. And the second reason was a more subtle one, which was to draw a contrast to successive presidents. This was written when President Trump was in office, but I asked everybody not to mention, even by inference, the current situation, because it would stop some people from reading the book, since the country is so polarized now. I said, just let who he was and what he did and how he did it to stand on its own without comparison. And I asked Robert Kaplan, the great journalist, to write a review of the book. And he said, oh, Andrew, I will not write the squib at the back of the book unless I can read it first. I said, I'm happy to have you read it. I don't think you can spend the time on it. He read it and he told me it was a fascinating book and he would be happy to write. And he wrote it really kind of an effusive squib on the back endorsing the book. It's written entirely by people who served in the administration, with one exception. That was Horst Tilschik, who was the National Security Advisor to Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany. We added a piece by him in this, one, because the German reunification was so important, and I wanted to get at least one person from another country who was particularly European at this point. But everyone else, there are scholars who are also diplomats and served in the administration, like Condi Rice. Phil Zelikow, I think, was a Foreign Service officer, but also a scholar of some note. And people like Richard Haas was not a Foreign Service officer, but I think he's widely admired and respected as a foreign policy expert, as the president of the Council of Foreign Relations. And so we had it written by people who actually served and who were writing about what they had done, as opposed to serving the administration, writing about what someone else had done. And so they capture stories and perspectives, I think, that are missing in other books. Now, there's some wonderful books that have been written on Bush. One of them is by John Meacham. I think he won the Pulitzer Prize for his review of, or his biography of Andrew Jackson. And he did this biography of the entire life of George Bush. And my friend Jeff Engel, with whom I disagree in some parts of Bush's career and time as president, he was the director of the Scowcroft Institute and taught at the Bush School well before I did, but he's now at Southern Methodist University. But he wrote a book called When the World Seemed New, a wonderful title, by the way. It's very similar to Dean Acheson's memoirs, where he said president at the creation, with the sense of something new having been created. Of course, Dean Acheson was Secretary of State, and then before that, Deputy Secretary of State or Undersecretary of State under Truman. I've asked a number of historians and scholars in perspective now to rank Bush. And they do rank him. John Meacham said the three great presidents in foreign policy in the post-World War II period were Truman, Eisenhower, and Bush, which I thought was an interesting comparison. Richard Haas compares Bush and says it's Truman and Bush on foreign policy, the two great presidents. And I happen to agree with that. And so I asked people to to take a scholarly, not just a memoir and not just war stories, but a scholarly view. We have a number of Foreign Service officers who wrote chapters, like Tom Pickering. I wrote a very extensive chapter because, of course, he was ambassador to the UN, which is very unusual to have a career diplomat as ambassador to the United Nations. We had Ed Dirigian, who's the head of the Baker Institute at Rice University, who, of course, was a career Foreign Service officer, and he was ambassador to Syria and told, he came and spoke at the Bush School. I said, would you transcribe your lecture and maybe make it more formal, and you can put it as a chapter in the book? And he agreed to do that. He did say something in his lecture, and I can't remember whether he included it in the chapter. He said, I served under many, many presidents, but the only president where I knew had my back were President Bush and Jim Baker. And so I took more risks. I did more things that I would have done. I would have been more cautious if they were not covering my back. And I have to say, I did the same thing when I was OFDA director. I did take an awful lot of risks and did things because I knew the president was watching. In fact, it's an interesting story. He was up speaking in Boston, and the four legislators who ran his campaign that I mentioned earlier, the Speaker of the House, who was a Democrat, did not like us because we caused so much trouble. He called us the Four Horsemen, I think the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse from Revelations. President Bush used to call us the Four Horsemen. And he was up in Boston speaking when I was at the Bangladesh typhoon, which killed 125,000 people in the space of an hour. And Governor Paul Cellucci, I think he may have been lieutenant governor then, or I think he was lieutenant governor then. He said, well, if Andrew were here, the Four Horsemen would be with us. And President Bush said, no, he's in Bangladesh with the response to the emergency there. And in fact, Frank Young was actually charged of the AID mission of the response from the mission's perspective. And Andy Card called me up and he said, you do know whenever you travel abroad, he reads all your dispatches. I said, what? I said, I'm only an office director. He reads he said he's really interested in humanitarian issues. And I did not understand why. It was at the very end of the administration. I didn't see Bush many times because I was only an office director. I saw his son many more times because I was the aid administrator. And I was in the Oval Office with Phil Johnston, who had been the president of CARE and took over as the coordinator for humanitarian assistance in Somalia. I was the US coordinator for the United States government for humanitarian assistance during the Somali civil war in 91, 92, where, I think 250,000 people had died in the famine. It was horrible. And he, of course, sent troops in. And that's the one meeting I had in the White House with the president at the just end of December of 1992. And he said something, and I finally realized why he was watching what I was doing. I thought it was just because I had been with him for so long. And he said to Phil Johnston, he said, we met before. And Phil Johnston said, I'm surprised you remember. He said, my wife and I had never been to a displaced camp or a refugee camp before. And there was a famine in 1985 in Sudan. He was there to arrange for the Falashas, the Ethiopian Jews, to go to Israel. And he did it quietly with General Numeri. I think it was Numeri. And he went to a camp, and he was quite shocked with Barbara about what they saw. And he said, I did not realize what the world was like in these camps. And he said that to me. He said, Andrew, I realized that I was the one that insisted you take that job, even though you didn't want it. I didn't want to be OFDA director. And it's because it meant so much to him that the United States take leadership role in these emergencies around the world because of what he had seen and experienced in those camps, which is very memorable for someone who's not used to crises of this kind in the developing world. Part of the book was also motivated by a great loss we've experienced of what I call the New England tradition of old Brahmin Yankees. And if he were alive, he would have been angry with me for the book, because Gene Becker said, Andrew, you're not supposed to mention New England. He wanted to be a Texan. I said, yeah, but he wasn't a Texan when he was born. He was born in Massachusetts. He was brought up in Connecticut. He went to Yale. He went to Phillips Andover, a private elite school in Massachusetts. He's a New England Brahmin Yankee. That's what we call him in Boston. And I said, there's nothing to be embarrassed about. Henry Cabot Lodge, Elliot Richardson, you go through the list. Christian Herter, who was the Secretary of State in the Eisenhower administration at the end. It's an honorable tradition of service. But Bush got a lot of hits because of his patrician manner and all that. And I hear people using very nasty words about, that's supposed to be a criticism now. I don't think it's a criticism. I think we're losing something by losing that tradition. So I emphasized that. I was told not to push it too much in the book, and we didn't, but I did mention it in my introduction. I think the thing that we did not cover, and I was deeply involved in, was Africa or Latin America, because some of the people who are going to write for that dropped out at the last minute. And I'm hoping we can do another book on the international economic policies of the Bush administration, the Brady bonds that helped resolve the debt crisis in Latin America, for example, the ending of the civil wars in Central America, and those kinds of issues, and the democracy initiatives in Latin America. The other thing that I wanted to cover in the book are sort of the worldview and the focus of Bush as president in foreign policy. And I think there are four broader pillars, not of policy. One was on focus on implementation. A lot of the audits of AID, and I would say if we audited the State Department in a programmatic way, it would be the same thing. The problem is not the policies. The problem is implementation of the policies. And we sometimes think, I was a former legislator for 12 years, and I can tell you the only thing you do is you fashion compromises and you get votes, but you ultimately just have to get legislation. You don't have to implement it. And sometimes when we write things and we have no experience running things, we write things that, I look in retrospect, I don't know why I ever wrote those pieces of legislation, because they're not easily implemented. But Bush was very focused, more than any president in the last 40 or 50 years, on implementation of foreign policy, as opposed to just the development of the policy itself. And so execution made a huge difference. Bush also was an incrementalist. I mean, he was criticized for not having vision. I actually think that was a good thing, not a bad thing. I compared him in the introduction to the Burkean tradition of British conservatism, Tory conservatism, where incrementalism was very important, slow, moderate change, because revolutionary change often results in unexpected and frequently very bad consequences, particularly in foreign policy. He also was an institutionalist, more than most presidents, because he had served in so many positions and saw what strong institutions could do and weak institutions could do, the damage that weak institutions could do. He did take a longer view of history. I was speaking at a seminar, I think it was either the former foreign minister or the former finance minister of Mexico, who had a hand in negotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was approved under Clinton with Republican support, I might add, but it was negotiated basically by Carla Hills and Bob Zellick and other people in the State Department. He said to me something I had never realized. He said, you don't realize it was not just an economic calculation on Bush's part, and there are articles on this, that the only Latin American country that we did, other than Cuba, that we never had joint military exercises with, we didn't work with it, we didn't bring Mexican military officers to our Defense Department schools and all that, was Mexico. And it's probably because of the Mexican-American War. There's so much bitterness still remaining in the Mexican elite over the war, that Mexico would take an opposite view from us in many respects on international issues just because of that history. That shifted, and this former cabinet minister told me, he said, Andrew, if you look at what happened since Bush negotiated that agreement, and since the benefits to Mexico, a 40% increase in national income, since the agreement was signed and implemented, that Mexico now sees it in their interest to be not agreeing with the United States all the time, but that we would be much more cooperative in our foreign policy with the United States, while before we saw it as an adversarial relationship. So Bush always looked toward the longer term, and that did not endear him to some people in the neoconservative movement or the liberal internationalist movement, which they wanted broader statements of vision. I know the neocons were very critical, and the liberal internationalists, that he didn't advocate very early on for Ukrainian independence, when in fact we knew from intelligence reports, I knew from the State Department. I had a relationship with senior people in Russia on the emergency side, and they were very worried about a coup potential. And of course, it did take place, a coup attempt against Gorbachev. And Bush's calculation was, if we run around saying we want Ukrainian independence, there'll be a coup now to remove Gorbachev, and we can't afford to have that happen. So he took a lot of hits for not advocating that, when in fact, the reason he didn't made great sense from a longer term point of view. So the other thing that Bush was a strong supporter of, as you know, was of international institutions. You know, I have worked with the United Nations and with the ICRC and a lot of other international organizations over the years. I know their weaknesses. People who run around saying they can govern the world is, it's just nonsense. They can't. But without them, we would have a huge gap. We need international institutions as forum for reaching consensus on issues and for sometimes implementing things, but we shouldn't go too far in thinking that they can do things, particularly without our support. I think the United Nations has been in decline when the United States has not been at the forefront, behind the scenes, of implementing things with and through the United Nations quietly. I mean, we used to do this all the time, and the AID, but the State Department would do it too, where we would put our officers, and the Defense Department did it. We would put our officers quietly on the staffs at the Secretariat or even in the field when we didn't think the career people in the UN were up to par. I think they are much far more now than they were before. But Guterres did say, without the United States leading the UN, it does not work. He said that publicly. I was shocked that he said it, but I think it's true. Bush understood that. And we shouldn't think the United Nations is going to be able to fix every problem in the world. On the other hand, if we don't use the UN, or we don't work with the UN, then we're making a big mistake in terms of protecting the national interest broadly defined of the United States and of our allies and friends around the world. Finally, the last comment, and then I will turn it over to Frank for questions. Bush was a compassionate conservative, or realist. Realist is the best word, but not a structural realist. We have debates at the Bush School, which we tend to be a more structural realist school as opposed to liberal internationalist school. I don't have a lot of use for these theories because, frankly, there are no presidents who are purely liberal internationalists, including Woodrow Wilson himself. He did things that were realist, better for worse. But Bush really did care about international humanitarian issues, and he helped create the existing system that we respond to emergencies through, without going into all the details. And it has worked. Alex DeWall wrote a book called Mass Starvation, which is a history of famine. And he said there's been a substantial decline in famine deaths since the mid to late 1980s, when, of course, many of these institutions like OCHA were put into place in the UN. And OFDA was substantially improved and expanded in terms of staff and money under the Bush presidency. The DART team, the Disaster Assistance Response Team, which has become very well known, were put in place in the summer of 1989. I remember it well because I was the director when it was done. It was invented by Julia Taft, my predecessor as OFDA director, and Bill Garbelink, who's a career foreign service officer, but they never actually made it happen because they came up with the idea just as they were leaving, just as Julia was leaving office, because Will had been appointed ambassador to NATO. Anyway, so my point here is that a lot of the humanitarian infrastructure that we now take for granted was in fact created during that period. It wasn't according to a written plan with big speeches, but if you look incrementally at all of the things done, it laid the foundation for the current system that we have in place now. And by Alex DeWall's estimate, there has been, now it's not just from this system, he says, it was also because of globalization that famine deaths have declined, and because a number of totalitarian regimes that exterminate their own population using food as a weapon have been in decline. But he said the international humanitarian response system is to a great degree responsible for the decline in deaths. Anyway, those are my comments. If you want to deal with individual, the taking out of Noriega, I was sent down to with the team to deal with that from a humanitarian perspective, because there was some displacement of population, or German reunification, or the relationship with Gorbachev, or the Gulf War, Middle East peace talks. There are a lot of issues that we can talk about if you have questions on. So Frank, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for those really a fascinating set of insights into into both the personality of President Bush as he tried to navigate what during that period of 1989 to 1993 was probably one of the most intense periods in U.S. foreign policy. I think we sometimes forget that all these things, such as the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the reunification of Germany, the fall of the Soviet Union, the first Gulf War, the Somalian humanitarian intervention, just to name 5, all occurred within such a short period of time. And I'm going to take the sort of chair's prerogative as we wait for people to weigh in here. What struck me about what you said was the comparison between Harry Truman and George H.W. Bush. These were two individuals that faced remarkable challenges and literally tectonic changes in the global environment during their presidencies. Truman had a term plus about 3/4 of another, and President Bush only had 1 term. But despite the fact that they both faced some very intense situations and changes in global politics, I could think of no 2 people more different from each other in personality, skill sets, backgrounds, but yet they drew upon certain qualities that allowed them to really address these major challenges. For me, one of them was the ability to recognize the talent in the career service and the ability to delegate. I think in Truman's case, it was letting George Marshall announce the Marshall Plan rather than Truman himself doing it, recognizing that Marshall probably was more popular than Harry Truman was at the time in the country. From the vignettes in the book, it's remarkable how President Bush really had direct interactions with people at the career level. Ed Dirigian's chapter is just one great example of it. I'm wondering if you could just talk a bit about what these 2 very different personalities and very different presidents, knowing that you're a student of American history yourself, what they had in common and what was it they brought to bear on being able to address these global challenges in their own presidencies.
Well, Truman didn't actually have a college degree, as I recall. So he certainly, not only did he not go to Ivy League schools. He didn't go to college at all. I think he may have gone to a few, but he did not. I don't think he had a college degree, which is very unusual for a president. But he did serve in World War I. I think he was a artillery officer in World War I. So he had combat experience, as did George H.W. Bush. And he was George H.W. Bush was. He actually, I think he lied on his military application. He said he was 18 when in fact he was only 17. And his plane was shot down, and the two men on the plane with them were killed. And I can't remember their names right now, but Bush used to tell me the story. He said one day did not go by in his entire life that he did not think of those two guys. I think he had what psychologists would call survivor's remorse, which is a psychological condition from someone who went into shock when close friends died in front of them. And Bush kept asking the question, why did they die and I survived? And instead of becoming depressed over it, he turned that around to remind himself every day that he needed to act in a way that was beyond himself. He was the opposite of a narcissist. All presidents have some narcissism in them. Without going into details, we've had one who was extraordinarily narcissistic, but it is a characteristic. Not a George Bush, I have to tell you. He told a story once. I heard him say he came back from a baseball game when he was in high school, and he hit a home run, and the bases were loaded, so they won the game. And he told his mother that, and his mother said, "Yes, well, how did the rest of the team do?" And he said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "It's not important how you did, George. It's how the whole team did." He told that story so many times. He all told us. He said, "Stop worrying about your careers and yourself. Worry about how all of us are doing together." So we would fight less, you know. And they say that there was less infighting in the Bush administration than any recent president. And they used to have weekly meetings. The deputy secretaries privately lunch to try to resolve things so they didn't get into these constant battles between defense and state and all that. I think it was very useful. I think he was a gentleman. And some people used to say, you know, that's because he's a wimp, he's weak. Well, why would we say a gentleman is a wimp? Because they have good manners and they don't insult people all the time, or that they don't say crass things, and they treat adversaries as someone who they disagree with, not as an enemy. And I think there's something to be said for that myself. And this is true, by the way, of both parties. It's not a comment about one party. But anyway, I'm not sure that answered your question, but the one thing I would add, Frank, is that the most important thing, that Bush knew this better than any American president in recent time, the most important thing any president does is to appoint other people in office. The president doesn't run the federal government. He doesn't have time to, and he doesn't have the capacity to. And it's too big and it's too complicated. There are too many issues. And so the most important thing you do is you appoint a team of people to run it. And those decisions actually are what determine whether you are successful or not, by choosing a Jim. I used to ask career Foreign Service officers who's the greatest secretaries of state were, and they all had different opinions, but Jim Baker was always in the list. And I said, why? He said, because he was able to call George Bush on the phone and say, George, you can't do this. You need to do this. And Baker, there are a lot of funny, very, very funny stories about what Baker would say and do in front of Bush. And Bush would be embarrassed in front of foreign leaders that Baker was so blunt. Some of the things he'd say, he was right. But Bush would, you know, say, just because of good manners, would say, I'm not sure we should have said that way in front of these people. But they worked as a team so well. And it's also true of Brent Scowcroft. Brent Scowcroft is revered still in the foreign policy elite of the United States because of his manner and the lack of ego he had, and how brilliant he was, how farsighted he was. And that's a long answer, I'm sorry.
No, that's no, I think that's fascinating comparisons and you know, I think the points that you made, and I listed them during your talk about President Bush being focused on implementation, being an incrementalist, being an institutionalist, they all begin with I. But all of those things I think are forgotten, and maybe people conflate those things which aren't flashy as necessarily being weak, and that's just not the case. We've got a question here from Alan Van Egmond. Alan asks, how would President Bush have related to the current crisis in US-Russia relations, or with China for that matter? He adds, it appears President Putin is displaying leadership to transform foreign relationships more in keeping with his perception of Russia's national security interests, ditto with Chinese Chairman Xi. At this point, do you see us treading water or not effectively advancing transformative leadership principles in our foreign affairs?
Well, I have to tell you, I was absolutely appalled at the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Just the way we did it, I wouldn't have withdrawn at all. I mean, I would have kept a base there, as we did in South Korea and Japan and Germany. Why we couldn't keep a base of 2,000 troops? We hadn't lost any troops for 2 years. But let me not. I'm going into it too much. But I think that did damage. And my view is all events in foreign policy are connected to all other events. And George Bush believed that. Some presidents, including ones with experience, don't seem to understand that they're connected to each other. I'll tell you a story. I'm in North Korea. I follow North Korea. I wrote a book about the North Korean famine, but I follow their diplomacy. And it's very interesting to me when Gaddafi was being taken out in Libya, with our active support. It wouldn't have happened without the Air Force monitoring him and our drones and all that. The North Korean Foreign Ministry actually issued a release saying, we now know what happens when countries give up their weapons of mass destruction because of pressure from the United States. After they get rid of their weapons, the United States will kill them. That's what they said in their release. I said, did they have a meeting at the NSC where some career diplomats said, you know, people in other areas of the world are going to watch what we're doing with Gaddafi. I mean, I think Gaddafi was a psychopath. I met him once when I was envoy to Sudan because they were deeply involved in Darfur. But what's the message when you're doing it? So I do think that one of the problems we have now is we are dealing with the aftermath around the world of what happened in Afghanistan and the perception that we're just going to sort of leave. I have written widely long before the current crisis in Ukraine that Putin is not what he appeared to be. The notion that he's a pragmatist, I hesitate using these words, but I wrote a piece for, we released a document, which I basically dissented on with my piece to all the presidential campaigns on how to deal with Russia. It was from people who had come to a conference at the Bush School. And I wrote a piece saying that, in fact, Putin is a modern day fascist. And I hesitate using that term. The Russians, there's a lot of Russian literature that's neo-fascist now, and some of the intellectuals that are on the air all the time say outrageous things in the air long before Ukraine. They're obsessed with race. You know, we need to make sure all the Russians are protected. And when Putin said the Ukrainians are Russians, the same culture, the same language, the same religion, all that, I said that's what Hitler used to say in the 1930s. It's outrageous. We don't want to have a war in Europe, but I think if we give in to Putin, we're making a terrible mistake because it won't end with the Ukraine. Now, I think that Putin will then try the 3 Baltic states, which are members of NATO. Of course, Ukraine is not. And I think he wants to break NATO up, and the best way to do it is to show that it's an empty suit. You know, if we let the 3 Baltic states be taken over by Russia, then NATO's finished as an institution, because it means we're not going to comply with the provisions of the treaty, which say if one country is attacked, then all of us are attacked. So I do think we should, I don't think we should, threaten war. I would never have said we wouldn't send troops in. I don't think it would be wise to send troops in, but I would never have said that statement. So I do think careful diplomacy could protect us. The other thing is, there are reasons Putin is behaving the way he is, and some of it has to do with how we have behaved. And the Russians make some interesting points, and I would be listening to them. This notion of we don't talk to people who are adversaries of ours, that's dangerous. I don't think we should give in to them, but I think we should be having conversations with them, because you can't understand their perspectives if you don't actually talk with them. And that's why we have back channels to do that. I mean, Ryan Crocker, who was our dean, said, yeah, we have conversations with the Iranians for a long time under Bush 43. I didn't like them, but he was involved in some of them, because they do have interests and we have to recognize what they are. Doesn't mean we have to agree that they can do anything they want to protect them. But I do think we're at a critical moment now, and I'm worried that the chain of events are going to lead to something very unfortunate that we're going to regret later on. I am worried also that the Russians and the Chinese might take action on Taiwan and Ukraine at the same time, military action, and that way we would be confused as to what to do. We couldn't fight two conflicts at the same time. Anyway, we'll see. I hope I'm wrong. Maybe I'm too much of a hardliner.
Well, as we are waiting for other people to weigh in, I taking off from that, I wonder if you could talk a bit about your perception of today's National Security Council and the policy-making process that we see today in confronting global challenges. You make a point in the book that Scowcroft really remade the National Security Council and that structure, and it was a far more efficient. It was a smaller and more efficient, or at least it seemed that way, process under Brent Scowcroft. I'm wondering if you could kind of look at, give us your perception of the process today, how you view it today. What have we lost since the Scowcroft time, and what are some of the things that perhaps could improve the process? Well,
Bush had, or Scowcroft had, 50 people in the NSC. He chose very carefully who they were. They were all, a very large number of them were career officers from, of course, from state and from principally the Defense Department, and there were officers from AID, as a matter of fact, too. 50 people, all of them. Jane Hall-Lute wrote the chapter on the NSC reforms, and she said, Andrew, I went through, and I don't think she finished it, but she went through all 50 people and what happened to them, and all of them became 4-stars or ambassadors or assistant secretaries of state. So Brent chose very carefully highly skilled people who went on to very senior positions in the career service or outside. I had a very small staff at OFDA. We had 45 people when I started. We went up to 60. There are something like 1,700 people in OFDA right now in Foods for Peace. 1,700 versus 60. Now, and the budget is massive for OFDA and Food for Peace now. It's like $3 or $4 billion. I was astonished to see the size of it. I did ask some younger aid officers, who is the OFDA director? This is before AID merged OFDA with Food for Peace. I said, can you tell me about the director? He said, I had no idea who the director is. I said, you don't know who the director is? Did the director send you messages out to tell you what to do? No, it filters through the system, it's a big bureaucracy and all that. I think there is something to be lost, not to have the director in charge. I mean, everybody knew who the director was when I was director, because we met all the time. and there were direct instructions that I gave out to people and my successors. It wasn't just me. So size is, and I looked at the numbers under President Obama. There were 400 people at the NSC under President Obama. Many of them were younger people in their 20s and 30s who did not have substantial foreign policy experience. And sometimes I had a military officer tell me that they were calling battalion and brigade commanders in Afghanistan and Iraq, giving them direct orders from the NSC, 25, 30-year-olds. And it did not go over too well in terms of the command structure to have that happen. So I do think bigger is not necessarily better in terms of workforce. I've reached that painful conclusion. We needed more officers at aid, and state did too, but I think it got carried away somehow. And I'm not sure it's better at all. I think the quality is what's most important, not the numbers. And we forget that sometimes.
But as you look at the interagency process.
Well, then I'm sorry, I didn't answer the question. The interagency process now is more highly developed, but you know, the argument has been at the Defense Department, if it doesn't like what the NSC decides, it just won't do it. And I saw that under 43, is if Rumsfeld didn't like something, just even though the president had signed it, he wouldn't do it. Yeah. And it used to enrage me and enrage state as well. But under 41, that would not have happened because it was a smaller group, and Bush did not take well to people not carrying out their orders. Right. And neither did Scowcroft. Right. President made a decision. So I think it's not a matter of just the process of making the decision, it's the process of implementation, which was so important.
Fred Gerlach has raised his hand. Fred, would you like to ask your question in person? Fred, you'll have to unmute, Fred. Fred, you're still muted. There he is. Go ahead, Fred.
Yeah, my specialty is the Middle East, and particularly Saudi Arabia. Of course, a lot of the foreign policy issues have to do with that area. And I just wondered whether you have any general points of view on it regarding both policy, but also people who have implemented that policy.
Well, I had Dennis Ross write a chapter. And of course, President Bush was seen as hostile to Israel or not supportive enough. And it did hurt him in his reelection campaign. And the attack was made that, you know, he wasn't supportive enough and all this. And I didn't know half the things that Dennis Ross said that Bush did for Israel. For example, they got a very large number of countries to recognize the existence of Israel and establish formal diplomatic relations. I did not know how far Bush went in trying to do that and to reduce Israel's isolation, which was one of the reasons for their aggressiveness, is to defend themselves. They felt isolated in the world, and this reduced that isolation. And the interesting thing is now how things have changed because Iran's such a big threat. Israel has now got relations with the Gulf states and other Arab Sunni states that see Iran as a threat have now begun to work with Israel in a cooperative way. So the geostrategic balance has changed. I mean, it used to be before Erdogan that Turkey was an ally of Israel under the nationalist governments and the military dictatorships in Turkey. I shouldn't say military, the military involvement. They were much closer to Israel, and now they're much more hostile because he is. I think he's a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, he said things that were when he was. I was in Athens with my relatives and friends, and they said, "Don't misunderstand who this guy is. He's not a Democrat at all. Small d. He is. I think they told me he sees himself as a new sultan. And I wouldn't be surprised if Turkey at some point announces that they're reestablishing the caliphate, which is the center of Islamic teaching in the Sunni world. They haven't done that yet, but I'm waiting. I mean, the caliphate was abolished, of course, under Kemal Ataturk in the early 1930s in the Constitution. The secular Constitution was put in place. I think we're seeing, to answer your question, we are seeing a reestablishment, a reemergence of the ancient empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Persian Empire, the Arabian Empire, because we've withdrawn and we're seen as pulling back. Now, the risk, of course, is that other countries worried about Iran's nuclear weapons program is going to secretly develop their own nuclear program. I think their countries are already doing it and they're not telling anyone, or they've already done it. Israel has nuclear weapons, we now know, because they feel insecure. And if you feel insecure, you remedy that with military technology sometimes. So I think the risk of a larger scale conflict that could get out of hand in the Middle East is higher now as the United States is perceived to be withdrawing. And we see the reinsertion of Russia in a very unhelpful way. The stuff, I mean, they did what they thought was in their national interest, but the destruction of Syria as a nation state was simply unbelievable. The Russians were piloted. There was a front page story in the New York Times with actual transcripts of the Russian pilots bombing hospitals, systematically bombing hospitals in Syria, in violation of every international convention on Geneva Conventions on medical facilities not being part of military campaigns. So I think there's a risk of this balance of power politics resulting in a conflict that then gets out of hand at some point. Now, that's not going to happen in the next couple of years, but I foresee it over the next 10 years. So I did not support our perceived withdrawal by Republican and Democratic presidents. I think we had to be much more careful about our interventions militarily, but to announce that we're just going to pull back, it left a void, and it's being filled in a way that may not stabilize the Middle East, which is one of the most unstable and dangerous regions of the world in terms of a potential international conflict. I'm sure that answers your question. But...
Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Thanks for that question. Andrew, you're also sort of a North Korea watcher. You were one of the first people in the 90s to raise the issue that famine was a reality in North Korea, and of course you were proven right. North Korea remains one of the great enigmas, I think, in our ability to solve this particular foreign policy crisis. You've seen almost everything tried from your perspective, particularly from the humanitarian perspective. What do you think a breakthrough would look like if we were able to somehow get a meaningful, sustained dialogue going with North Korea?
I don't think dialogue is going to help with North Korea. The North Korean state, one, there is a famine going on in North Korea right now. It's very clear to me, given, some analysts are saying it was because of American sanctions. It's not because of American sanctions, okay? There is a provision in the sanctions regime to allow food and humanitarian assistance. That's not the issue. The issue is that Kim Jong-un, with advice, I presume, from his closest advisors, to close the border with China. They have not accepted, they don't export anything to China. They don't import anything to China. That was 90% of their trade. There was a massive reduction in not just trade, but revenue, because what they were doing is the Chinese modernized all of their coal mines, which they have an extensive number of, and they were exporting all that coal to China in exchange for food, because they can't produce enough food on their own. it's still a collective farming system that does not work very well. And they have the fifth lowest. I did a calculation for the book I wrote called The Great North Korean Famine. North Korea has the fifth lowest arable land per capita in the world. Most of North Korea is mountains. You can't, and it's not, you know, it's not usable as land for agriculture. And so they have a problem to begin with. But, you know, the South Koreans also have a problem. They simply export industrial goods and then import food when they need it. But they also have a private farming system, which North Korea doesn't have. I think the North Korean regime is going to build nuclear weapons no matter what we do. And we need to get used to it and develop, as the Japanese are developing, systems to protect themselves if they should launch something. Japanese are developing some new system to counter the supersonic missiles that North Korea. I don't actually think the North Koreans have those missiles. I think they're sort of trying to scare us into thinking they do. The reason for those weapons is several-fold. Number one, they know that no one cares what happens in North Korea in terms of they're not a major power. They shouldn't be a major power. They're a small country in with an anemic economy, and they can't feed themselves. But they have the fourth largest land army in Asia, actually maybe in the world, more over 1 million soldiers. Now, I have to tell you, from the research I did, a very large number of them couldn't fight a war if they wanted to. The average North Korean soldier is 9 centimeters shorter because of chronic malnutrition than the average South Korean soldier. And I was in Seoul giving a talk at a conference on North Korea, and I had a young man who was a master's student, and he was a military officer as well. And he was telling me, he was 6 feet tall. And he said, I tutor North Korean refugees who've escaped. All of them are short. It's because of chronic malnutrition. And they all say, how come you grew into such giants, the South Koreans? And it's because of diet. That's what the real difference is. They're genetically the same people. But they have 200,000 or 300,000 special forces that are in better shape physically, that could wreak havoc, and of course the artillery over the border would destroy Seoul. So I think we need to think through military means of defending ourselves against these weapons. We are not going to disarm them. They're not going to stop the nuclear weapons program, which they already have. Some estimates are maybe 30 nuclear bombs. The question is whether they have the capacity to deliver them. And many scholars think that they do have that now. They are evolving because the North Korean state is extraordinarily repressive. I'm the co-chairman emeritus of the Committee on Human Rights in North Korea, which is a research group. Roberta Cohen and I were the co-chairman for a number of years of the group, and bipartisan. And we produce reports, probably about 40 reports now on North Korean human rights and these kinds of issues. I think it's really pathetic. I've been to North Korea. I spent two weeks there in the 1990s, 1997 during the famine. And then I went up to the North Korean border with China undercover. I told the Chinese I was a tourist. And I went up with a Buddhist monk friend of mine from South Korea who had an underground NGO helping people escape during the famine. This was in December in 1998. Do not go to North Korea or China and along the border with the Tumen River in December. It's extremely cold. But I learned what was going on based on that. I actually, if things were more open, I'd go back up there now to try to find out what's really happening inside the country. I think there's a terrible famine, and I think there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of deaths already from starvation because they do not have enough food. And there are indications there's a famine from multiple sources.
Well, we have reached the end of our hour, and Andrew, this has been a fascinating hour. Your observations, your insights into the Bush 41 administration, your observations on the Middle East and North Korea from your personal experience. We've all benefited very much from having you today with us for this past hour. And on behalf of the Foreign Service Retirees Association of Florida, I want to thank you for joining us. And if we were live at this point, it would be my privilege to present you with a gift token of our appreciation, but I'm told it's coming to you under separate cover.
It
And
already arrived, Frank.
wonderful, wonderful.
I have it right here just to show you that it
Hey, can
arrived.
you? Excellent. Oh, that's
Thank you
wonderful.
very much.
Well, Andrew, thank you again so much. And thank you to all our membership for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you in March, hopefully live. We will be monitoring the situation here in Florida to ensure that if we are able to meet live with Eric Rubin, president of AFSA, we will do so. So stay tuned, keep in touch. Rebecca, do you have anything at the end you want to add?
Just to let everybody know that we'll be posting this on our YouTube channel within about 5 to 7 days.
Great.
Yeah, send North Korea to Kim Jong-un. I'm sure he'd want to watch.
Yeah, sure he'll be interested.
I'll send
Or
him an
to Putin.
invite.
Send it to Putin. I'm sure he'd appreciate it.
Okay. All right, everyone. Thank you again, and our meeting is adjourned. Thank you, Andrew.